This morning, we're going to have Pam Gay speak from the coroner's office and Cindy Richards speak. And they're going to talk about suicide prevention.
Good morning. I'm Pam Gay, for those that may not know me. I am a registered nurse. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. All right. I'm a registered nurse who ran for coroner in 2013 and was elected and have been in office since 2014. My background had been mostly in critical care and emergency medicine. I really didn't do much in the way of mental health or drug addiction, other than what I experienced with those issues in my own life with my family and so on. I didn't really know too much until I became coroner, and I had baptism by fire, I guess you would say. I just want to briefly talk about the statistics. I sometimes hesitate to do that because I want to reiterate that every one of these numbers is a person and a family and is connected to lots of other people. Sometimes the statistics can take that personal side out of it. But I think for us to understand about suicide prevention in York County, you need to kind of have an idea of what the deaths are attributed to that. So the number 1 and 2 types of trauma deaths, you could say, that our office is exposed to on pretty much a daily basis are suicides and drug overdoses. So this really goes hand in hand, which is one of the reasons why we have developed this presentation. Even though they're kind of 2 presentations, they're very intermingled. We talk about it all the time, how the 2 are related. So when I came into office in 2014, we actually peaked with our suicides, probably, I think it was our highest number ever. By the end of that year, we had 87 suicides. 87? 89, sorry. 89. I think I'm getting mixed up from the year, my 7s, but anyway, 89 in 2014, which was our worst year ever. I was already a member of the Suicide Prevention Coalition, had met Cindy, and we got real aggressive over the last few years with the suicide prevention, which she's been very involved in for many more years than me. But we got more aggressive. Definitely, I started being able to give them the real-time numbers, and that really helped us draw attention to it. We also utilized the media as much as we could to draw attention to it, and they've been really a good support in trying to get the word out, just like they are with the drug issue. We actually wrote for a grant and were awarded a grant, and in 2015, through the Suicide Prevention Coalition, much of the work done by Cindy, we're able to get the Avidum clubs started in a bunch of the school districts in New York. If you don't know what Avidum is, we can go into more detail later, but it's basically a peer group led by an advisor usually, it basically focuses on anti-bullying, suicide education, what to look for, teaching them about depression, what to look for in their peers, and how to get them the help that they need. That program has launched in several more school districts since, even after the grant expired, and Cindy's done a lot of the curriculum education that has been mandated by the state now when it comes to suicide prevention. So made tremendous progress just in those 2 years. So we're really thankful for that. The suicides have gone down. They were in this, I think, 67 or 69, just 20 less last year. And then I don't know why 67 and 87 is hanging in my head, but that's what I always have been saying. But so 20 less last year, and then this year we're at 69 right now. So we have one that's pending. We're still waiting to hear back on. But so when I say this year, I mean 2016. Thankfully, we haven't gone up to those 80 numbers. However, 60s, almost 70s are still too much, as you can imagine. So we're still constantly in the effort to educate. One of the most remarkable and unfortunate things about this last year, and some of you may know that already, is that we've had 10 teen suicides between the 9th and 12th grade age levels. And that has never been, that's the worst it's ever been in York County. So that, has been very sad to know and learn and deal with, and with the families and with all the students and the school districts that have been impacted by those. But at the same time, as sad as that is, quite often it opens a door for us to get into those schools, maybe who had been more resistant. But we have a lot of work to do in the area of teen suicide still, even with the Avidum clubs and so on. It's still very much a real issue. And a lot of it's centered around social media and just their home situations and their peer situations with their friends, and never being able to escape that social media, the telephone, the cell phones. And so we see a lot of sadness and despair in the teens that we are trying to address and figure out, but very, very much all linked to mental health. So I'm going to turn it over to Cindy and let her fill you in on some of the history and what we're hoping to continue to do here in York. And then we will open it up for questions. I don't know, we'll probably do the questions towards the end. So I might give you a little break so that you can run to the bathroom and do other things before I start my section on substance abuse. So thanks.
Good morning. This is a difficult subject to talk about, especially on a Friday morning when we all want to go and have a nice weekend and stuff, but it's a very important topic. And one of the things I want to say at the very beginning is there is no boundaries when it comes to suicide. It could happen to anybody in this room, and it may have already happened to you. If you have a difficult time with this and it brings up a lot of memories and you're really struggling with it, take a walk, but please come back. I teach a class at York College and on suicide prevention, and this semester we added crisis intervention to it. It's a tough subject. It's something that it's very difficult to talk about, but our college age students are one of the highest risk age groups, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just it's a sensitive subject. So, but we're here for you. We're here to talk to you. I'm going to say right out front, we have support groups if you are a survivor meaning you have lost someone to suicide in your life. We have support groups, and I'll be glad to let you know about those too. And we have 3 in York County now. We've been talking about this this is our 10th year. And it's hard to believe that we've been doing this for 10 years, but I look back at our very first year and I see how we have grown, and much of it is to do with Pam. Once she came into office, we really she took the bull by the horns and really ran with this. But we also we're really grateful for the state to say that Act 71 for the school districts to have the training for the teachers in 6th to 12th grade, but many, almost all of the school districts have educated all their staff. And I think that is extremely important too. So I gave you, if you didn't get it, it's out there. I'm doing a 3-year study on suicide prevention in York County. And this is what I have so far. 3 years ran out December 31st, so I've just been working on this month. The next step is to find out why people have died by suicide. What is the reasoning behind it? And so we're still talking about it, but I also put on your table some information about our conference that's coming up September 7th. And I am extremely, really excited that Dr. Thomas Joyner is coming to speak. I heard him in Boston in December speak on suicide prevention. He lost his father in 1990 to suicide, and he has dedicated his life to do some research behind it. And his latest book is on murder-suicides. But he is phenomenal. He's just phenomenal. Anyway, I'm using his book in my class even, but it's Why People Die by Suicide. It's not a book that you all really want to read, but it's one of those books you can't put down because he just makes sense. And when I heard him speak, he was very, very refreshing. And I called him and I said, please come to York County. He's expensive, so there's also a sponsor sheet on there that if you would like to help sponsor him. But he's really, I'm telling you, he is really worth being here. So, getting all that out of the way, let's learn about it. The education process in York County, we really, really need to start talking about it, and we really, really need to bring York County together. There is still a large, large population that does not want to talk about suicide. And whether it's the school districts or whether it's organizations or agencies or whatever. And so we really, really do need to start talking about it. So here we go. I am a suicide assessment and intervention counselor also. I am certified in that. I'm also certified in QPR, which is question, persuade, and refer. And I will come out and speak and educate your organization or your company at no cost. So just have to call me. But anyway, it happens at all ages. Between the ages of 40 and 60, though, that is most popular between 40 and 60. But we have to start talking about it. And it starts with the people when people are younger. It starts with the cutting. It starts with the self-harming. So we have to really, really start looking at how people are coping with issues and what's happening in their lives. Again, like Pam said, it's a mental health issue. There's no real single cause for suicide, but we have to remember that suicide can happen to anyone. And I want to say, just because you know someone that has a mental health disorder does not mean they're going to take their life. There are a lot of things that you can do and what they can do to keep from taking their life. But there are some specific reasons that through a lot of research that Dr. Joyner did, he has come up with 3 things that is just, it's inevitable. And those are burdensomeness combined with failed belongingness. And with the addition, it takes an acquired ability to enact lethal self-injury. And what he means by that is you have to have some hopelessness, some helplessness, some feeling of not belonging, feeling of not being effective in anything you do, not feeling effective in your job, not feeling effective in your home. And with that mindset and with that thought process growing up, and we see a lot of kids that are going through abandonment issues, etc. Those are the ones that we are seeing that just don't feel like they belong. Foster kids, a huge number. They just don't feel like they belong. So, and drugs, that's why Pam's here today, because drugs are all part of it. It's just very, very important. But they have to work up to the ability to take their life. And I think that is something we need to really, really remember. They don't just get up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to die by suicide today. They have to work up to it. It is an extremely impulsive act. But you have to have the guts to do it. And so when people start out, younger, just like living on the edge or cutting or really doing a lot of self-harm and doing things that you and I maybe would not make sense of, they are working up to the ability to do it. For instance, he gives this in the book, but there was a gentleman that wanted to take his life, and he was going to do it by jumping off of a bridge, and which is very common. But he just couldn't do it. He had to build up to it. So he was a swimmer, so he jumped off of cliffs. He jumped off of anything he could find. He jumped off of houses, everything to build up to the moment where he could jump off the bridge. And when he decided to take his life, there was no stopping him. He just ran and jumped because he had built up to the ability to do that. So it's not just something we wake up and decide to do in the morning. Yes, you have to have the ability to do it. And a lot of times kids take the moment. that, you know, if they stay home from school because they don't feel well, the parents go to work, they have the moment to do it. One of the most important things you need to learn and you need to know is the warning signs. If you know the warning signs to suicide, you may be able to stop a suicide. Not necessarily, you may not be successful at stopping it, but at least you knew the warning signs. I can't tell you how many people have come into my office and said, I just didn't know the warning signs, and that adds to another whole guilt process. But I always tell people you can only be responsible for what you know. And if you didn't know the warning signs, you can't be responsible for that. So part of it is just, you know, suicide is one of the worst pains that you will ever go through. And you don't get over it. So don't expect people to go through the grief process and say, just get over it. They will never, ever get over it. So it's a pain like no other. So we're going to talk about some of the warning signs today. If a person talks about suicide, you need to listen. And I know, especially with kids, they will go through life and they will just say, you know, if I don't pass this test, I'm just going to kill myself. We need to stop that. We need to stop having kids say that. We need to stop adults saying that. And so if you hear somebody saying it enough, you need to stop them and say, do you really feel like taking your life? Do you really want to take your life? Because it just sounds like you're using that term a lot. So we need to allow them to talk about it and take every discussion seriously. Being a burden to others. We see that a lot in our older adults, but we also see it in our kids, especially kids that have abandonment issues. We see that they are struggling. They don't feel like they fit in. And if they have problems in life, you know, they feel like they're just a burden to their family. So we need to get them to talk about it. We need to get them to educate people around them about how they're feeling. A lot of times kids just want to talk, or anyone just wants to talk. They want people to listen to them. So the most important thing, if you hear anything today, is it's important to listen to people, not give advice. And I know, as many of you are probably parents, and we love to give our kids advice. Do they take it? Probably not, and some do. But we need to listen and really try to hold our tongue. One thing that you can do is ask them, I have some suggestions for you. Would you like to hear them? And especially with college-age students, you know, they really don't want advice. But if you have a college-age kid or you've been through that process, you know they don't want advice. But when they're ready to listen and for some advice, then that's the time that you really step in. They feel trapped. And they feel like there's no way out. They don't know what else to do. So we need to allow them to explore different ways of getting out. I talked to a mother at West Shore School District the other day when I was up there doing their training. And she said, I was a teacher, and she said, my daughter is just really, really having difficulties, and she wants to take her life. And she worked with her, talked with her, gave her her time and everything. And one day she came up to her mom and she said, I am really, really, really glad I didn't take my life. It's just that one more day. If you can get through just one more day. So I think it's really important that we make sure that the kids understand that it's permanent and that they need that one more day. Tomorrow might be another day. They may have broken up from a relationship. They may have done all kinds of different things in their life that they're ashamed of. But, tomorrow's another day. And so they can't really feel trapped. Experience unbearable pain. We talked about that. That pain is like no other, and they just want to end the pain. Most people do not want to die by suicide. They want the pain to go away. And we see a lot of people that have Our older adults that have Alzheimer's, that first stage of Alzheimer's, they can take their life. After that, they probably cannot. But that first stage, they know what's coming, and they don't want to put their family through it. So, be aware of it. Be aware of the pain that they're in. Kids, especially, if, it's the love of their life, they're never going to find another love. My world's coming to an end. There's going to be somebody else in your life, but you have to get them to understand that. I can't tell you how many, but relationships are a huge factor in suicide for adults and for kids. And I'm seeing that as I'm tallying up some of the main reasons. When people die by suicide, it is not the last event that is why they really died by suicide. It is the last straw. And we cannot blame the kids for taking their life on the last act. And we also have to remember that they have to, there's a person behind all that. And anytime you have a mental illness, you have to be able to see the person there. And they should not be defined by their mental illness. So like Pam said, statistics are statistics, but they're people too. And we have to remember that. And there are a lot of people in York County that have mental health issues. But we have to remember, that there's a person behind that. And usually, if you look, I'm sorry, but I do read obituaries, and you look at the people that have died by suicide, and they're really, really neat people. We had a pastor up in Dover that died by suicide, and when I read his obituary, I felt really bad that I never met him, because he was just an amazing, really amazing person. So, you have to remember that they're people, and they're just having that unbearable pain that they can't get over. And just having no reason to live. If I didn't live, then I wouldn't have these problems. And they're doing a lot of study in this area right now too on this is the way they cope with situations. If I take my life, it's almost like an addiction to suicide. If I take my life, I won't need to worry about that tomorrow. So having no reason to live and having that, having all that pain go away are really big reasons for dying by suicide. And then just killing themselves. If you see on the stat report, it used to be hanging for under 50. It used to be really popular, and now it's guns. But we just have to really start looking at what is available. And we had someone the other day that used what was it? The one that it wasn't acid. It was coolant type. Oh yeah. Antifreeze. Thank you. Antifreeze to kill himself. And his friend that went out with him the night before was there when he bought the antifreeze. And so he's the one that he's having a lot of difficulties with it right now because he was there with him. Man had no idea, absolutely no idea what he was going to use that antifreeze for. Because people buy antifreeze.
Very happy-go-lucky individual.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
Friends are just blindsided.
I did a crisis intervention. He worked at the hospital, and I did a crisis intervention with him. And I'm telling you, I would have loved to have met him. He sounded like just a really, really great guy. And so, it's really, really interesting to look at the person afterwards and see what kind of personality. It took them all by surprise. They had no idea. And we're going to also talk about how people say goodbye. And they didn't realize the night before that he was saying goodbye to them. So certain behaviors will spark the idea of suicide if you're looking at it. Alcohol or drugs in an increased amount, and I'm going to leave that to Pam to talk about, but we do see a lot of that. People that die by suicide usually have very high levels of alcohol in their system, and now it's drugs too. The online stuff, I'm going to show my age here, but you know, you can find anything online. And you can find online how to kill yourself. There are specific websites that you can go on. And some of the websites even show, tell you to practice first to make sure you get it right. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. So if you have somebody that's OCD or somebody that has to do everything perfectly, we had a couple like that in York County where we saw them print out how to complete suicide. They found something that worked for them, and they follow it step by step so they don't goof it up. And so obviously, you know, especially with kids, their whole life is around computers now. They can go online and Google how to die by suicide, and it's just amazing. So our online system is really a hindrance when it comes to suicide. And if you notice, if you heard about the murder-suicide in December, she put her suicide note on Facebook. Somebody just the other day had one on Facebook where a young lady actually went through the whole process on Facebook and taped it all. And we had a gentleman in Oklahoma, I believe, that did that too. So we've had a couple of them in York County where they've taped the actual doing of this, you know, while they're completing suicide. But we have to educate our kids, and we have to educate people, and we have to look at what they're looking at online. Acting recklessly, like I said, it's extremely impulsive act, and you have to build up to having the ability to take your life. Withdrawing from activities. I talked to a young lady the other day. Well, I did the talking. She didn't do any talking. But her mother was telling me that she couldn't wait till she got a driver's license. And she was counting down the days, but when it actually came was during a real depressive state that she was going through. And this was in October, and she still hasn't gotten her permit because she has no desire to do it. She was failing in school, and this was something that she was getting straight A's. And nothing is important to her anymore. And so that is a real big flag, especially when somebody really, really enjoys what they're doing. Not going anywhere, staying by yourself, the social anxiety piece of it all, just not enjoying life anymore, not going out with friends. And then all of a sudden, they're out with friends, they're having a good time and everything, and you think, we're over it. That's their way of saying goodbye. And they take their life. A lot of times there are parties beforehand, and families look back and they think, well, we thought we were over it, but they're not. That was their way of saying goodbye to their family and friends. Sleeping too much or too little, visiting or calling people to say goodbye. The incident that I was talking about earlier at the hospital, he gave everybody a hug, and when I was doing the crisis intervention with him the other day, they said, we thought when he gave a hug that it was really an unusual hug. Like he really, really hugged us. And when I let them know that was his way of saying goodbye, it was like, wow. We never thought, but because they didn't know he was going to complete suicide, you know. So I think this is something we have to really try to understand when we see people. We need to look at the whole picture. Just because they hug like that doesn't mean they're going to take their life, but it is a good way. We need to look at the whole picture. Giving away prized possessions. We've had kids give away iPods, iPads, their game systems, and all that before they take their life. Obviously, kids aren't going to do that, so that's a huge red flag. Adults, and especially older adults, if they start getting rid of their pets, that's something that we really need to, that's a red flag that we need to talk about. Aggression, they can be extremely angry, and they stay in that state for a long period of time. So when someone's like that, just talk to them. And one of the things we need to learn how to use is the word suicide. We don't, it's like having to talk to your kids about sex. We don't want to do it. It's the other S word. We don't want to talk to anyone about suicide. But if they have all the symptoms and the red flags, we need to use the word so that there's no reason for them to misunderstand what we're trying to say. And obviously moods. We have to look at the moods that they're in, and we have to see how often they are. People with bipolar disorder, are on a roller coaster half the time. So we have to look at them when they're very manic and also extremely depressed. So we have to go along with it and listen. Listening is the most important thing we can do. Just listen to what they're saying and read between the lines, because a lot of times they're not going to just come out and say to us, I want to kill myself. During the last campaign, the election campaign, I don't know how many people I heard, if this candidate does not get elected, there's no reason for me to live. And I'll tell you, the night of the election, I just was expecting all kinds. We did have one, but I was expecting all kinds of deaths. But we have to try to remember that, when they say something, and it's just really not something you have heard them say before, question them. Don't leave it alone. We need to look at their rage or irritability, the humiliation. A lot of times, humiliation of losing a job or doing something. We see kids that accidentally do things at school, or they're, DUIs, all these types of issues, and they think their life is over, but it's also, they humiliate their families. They feel they are humiliating their families. We've had kids that just have died by suicide because they don't feel like they fit in their family, and they've done something really, really wrong that their family won't forgive them for. So we have to really we really have to watch those kids. And sometimes they don't show, the thoughts of suicide ahead of time, but we have to talk to them about it. And then one of the things that I've really enjoyed, and the outcomes of, at York College, we started a program there 5 or 6 years ago, and every year I go and I do the QPR, and I do the training for the faculty and staff, and a lot of the students too. And we're doing it again in February. And since we started doing this, the counseling office has really, really picked up. The number of people have said kids are coming in and they're talking about it. And that's what we want. We want them to talk about it. They now have a program at York College where they can take their own mental health assessment in the privacy of their own room on their computers, and it goes out to the counseling office. So and it's huge, and it's one of the only classes for credit, for suicide prevention in the state of Pennsylvania. We've got to start doing more and more of that, because college, a lot of times kids get through high school because they have the support systems, they have a VEDM, they have all these things, but they don't have it when they get to college. And that's when, so many other doors open to the alcohol, the drugs, the miscommunications that we have in college. But we have to really, really start doing this, and we're starting it now in our high schools and our middle schools. The other thing too is kids have a lot more, and even adults have a lot more anxiety, especially during the times when we start having layoffs. Everybody's afraid of losing their jobs, and just different things are happening in our world right now. And we've had people that thought they could retire and do well for the rest of their lives, but they get sick, they have cancer, something happens, and their money is gone. And so we have to really, really start looking at the whole person and talking and listening. Okay, and then there's risk factors. These are the more prominent risk factors in our lives that do encourage suicide. And unfortunately, we have a lot of survivors in York County because our numbers are so high. We are, last I saw, I think we were 6th in the state for suicides, and we're South Central Pennsylvania is the area for murder-suicides. Last year we had 2 murder-suicides. The year before we had 4. So we are, York County is really known for its murder-suicides too. So when you throw domestic violence and things like that into the pot, it's really a good recipe for suicide. So some of the health factors, we all know, mental health conditions, but we also know that people have mental health conditions that they're treatable. A lot of times we see people go off their medication, and when they go off their medication and they refuse to see a therapist and they refuse to see a psychiatrist or whatever, they go down the tubes. So because they don't feel like they need it. So a lot of times they will take their life. But bipolar manic depressive disorder is number 1. We see that in a lot of our families. But anxiety disorders, I've had people come into my office that have been suicidal. And some of them are teachers. Some of them are people that are very well known in York County, and they're very educated, and they can't do it. And the stories they tell, I'm always in awe at the stories that I hear. But really sometimes boils down to just anxiety. And so we need to look at that, and we can't just pop a pill. We need to be able to take have some therapy along with it, and we need to understand that it's okay to go see a therapist. Yeah, in York County it's hard to get in. It takes forever. I just heard someone the other day that said they need their medication changed and it takes them 6 months to get in. So we do have to do better when it comes to our mental health system. But we can if we all stick together and do it. Substance abuse disorders, and Pam's going to talk about that. Serious or chronic health conditions and or pain. Like I said, they just want the pain to go away. And when they decide that the pain is too much, that's when they take their life. So we have to really understand that when somebody is going through pain, and that pain could be emotional pain. We see we see a lot of people that have been married for a very, very, very long time, and when their spouse dies, they just can't survive. We had a couple, I think last year or the year before, that the husband and wife died together. So we need to look at that, and families need to be aware of the pain that their parents are going through and what's going on. Because in this one situation that really stands out to me is he was dying of cancer, and she could not bear to live without him, and so they died together because he only had a few more weeks to live. So this is really, really traumatic to a family, but chronic health conditions can really, really heighten the suicide thought process. I don't know why I put previous suicide attempts, but I guess it's because it's extremely important. I put it up there twice. But I think we really need to look at this. When somebody has been put into a hospital or a treatment center, that first 100 days after they come out is extremely important. And they have to be in counseling. But a lot of them can't get into counseling. I see a lot of kids, especially within the first 100 days after they come out of treatment, because they can't get into a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And so that first 100 days, they will try to take their life again. So we really, really, really need to look at the whole situation with attempts and not just think that they're never going to do it again. They will. They will try it again. Especially if there is a family history of suicide. I heard a story the other day that I was just really appalled. It was a family of 10. There were 10 people in the immediate family. There was one person left. The rest of them, the other 9, took their lives. That was their way, their choice of dying. And I asked the person that was telling me this story, I said, are you know, is the 10th person planning to take their life? And they say, when the time comes, she will take her life too. That is their choice, their way of dying. Did they have health conditions? They had enormous health conditions. Everybody had a specific reason behind dying by suicide. But that was their choice. And I just can't imagine what the other family members were feeling at the time. I mean, you lose one person to suicide. Can you imagine losing 9, your whole entire family, to suicide? So it's really, really, it's something I can't even comprehend. But if you see people that are sitting around talking about their stories and talking about the pain that they're going through because somebody in their family has died by suicide, I can't imagine what it would be like for everyone. But family history of suicide is extremely important to understand. And mental health conditions run through families. And so generation after generation, especially bipolar disorder, generation after generation. And so we have to really look at that. And that's one of the first questions I ask people when they come into the office to be assessed for suicide is there anybody else in your family that has a mental health disorder? And what is it? And how close are they to this person, you know, whether it's several generations or if it's an immediate family member. So we have to look at the whole picture. This is the hotline. Feel free to use it. We have a coalition here in York County. Anybody can join that coalition. We do a lot of great things, and it only meets once every 2 months for an hour in the morning because we believe that getting out in the community is more important than sitting around with meetings, and I don't like meetings, so we get together every 2 months. You can always call me if you want to join us. It's a great opportunity to talk about how we can fix York County. And I'm telling you, York County is broken when it comes to mental health. And we need to, and people are dying right and left due to suicide. So we have not had a month without suicide since December 1999. And we haven't had, I think it was I think I put it on this sheet. Last year we had 15 weeks without a suicide. So I commend our coroner for, getting out there and doing what she's doing and trying to get people and working with families, through suicide prevention and working with it. She has a great group of people that go out and work with families after they've lost someone to suicide. And I think that is really, really tremendous. But we've just got to stop it. More people have died by suicide in the United States than have died from breast cancer. So we're doing something about breast cancer. You see pink everywhere, football games, you see it, especially I think it's October. Everybody's wearing pink, but we're not talking about suicide, and there is a greater risk of suicide, of dying by suicide, than breast cancer. So when, hopefully you all will attend when Dr. Joyner comes, because you will not be, you won't, it'll be the best thing you've ever been to. because he really knows how to get your attention, and he really has done a lot. His father died by suicide. So, he has some experience with it. But we do have support groups for people that have died by suicide, or for people that have lost people that have died by suicide. And we have them because the grief is so different. There is nothing like the grief of someone dying by suicide. They have tried going to regular grief groups, and they feel like outsiders. They feel like they have the big S on their face. And it does not end. It just doesn't end. And so we've had people there that lost people like 15, 20 years ago, and they're still having some issues. They still have those triggers. When that lady that died by suicide in December, and she took her son with her, the murder-suicide, I cannot tell you how many wounds that opened. And so we have to realize that every time there's a suicide, especially one that the media gets a hold of, and it's really out there, and we start talking about it, it really opens up wounds. And we had a huge group at our support group that night, and that's basically all we talked about was what triggers it made with them. And sometimes it's people that have lost people many, many years ago, but it opened those wounds. First year, you get through it. You just get through it. The second year is when you really, really start getting a hang of what's going on in your life. And some people have to move. Some people have to get new friends. It's a pain like no other. So we have to be there for them, and it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. But we have a whole program, a QPR program, question, persuade, and refer, how we get people to get help. And it's really, really important to go through that training, because we have to know how to talk to people, and we have to know that it's not just a one and done deal. We have to stay with them. So that's a whole nother session. But if you have any questions, we'll take them at the end. I want Pam to come up and talk.
All right, we're going to get started here because this is a lengthy topic, needless to say. I wanted to touch on two things that maybe some of you may ask on questions, because it's questions that we get asked all the time. So I want to just hit those before we get to this. One of the questions that we get asked all the time is why you call it completing suicide instead of committing suicide. Actually, it wasn't until Cindy explained to me about the history of suicide that I understood a little more about this, and it's just kind of an eye-opener. But many of you probably already know that suicide was basically, for hundreds of years, was treated as a crime in this, not just in this country, throughout the entire world. And actually, if you attempted suicide and failed, they actually hung you in the town square and finished the job for you. And then if you, it was treated as a crime, and not only, you're dead, okay, so they can't really charge you with anything because they more or less finished the job, but they also would take your land, not allow you to be buried in church cemetery, and basically treated your whole family as criminals. So that's where the term commit basically came from, to some extent, because there's a crime associated with it. So we've tried to get away from using that term commit, and we use the term complete, which I think is, I know some people get worked up about political correctness, but I think that actually that's a much more appropriate term. And thankfully, the stigma of not being allowed to be buried in the church cemetery is gone now. That left a couple decades ago, thank goodness. However, it's only been recently, I think, that more and more churches have been open to discussing suicide in the church. And there's still a stigma and some church beliefs that if you complete suicide, you are pretty much, that's the unpardonable sin, and you're going to hell. When I interview volunteers for our volunteer program, I ask them that question, and that is something that's very important to me. If you have that belief, you cannot help people with suicide who've experienced suicide. I'm not trying to question people's beliefs, but I want to be on the same page when we're reaching out to our families. I've had a full awakening in my life. I was raised very conservative and in church, but I will tell you that I do not believe that, and my pastor does not believe that. I think that maybe 20, 30 years ago, more and more people did. But this is a mental health issue, and they want their pain to end. And while it may be one of the 10 commandments, we all break the 10 commandments. And, if you believe like I do, everyone is as bad as the other. So we got to get away from that stigma that, those individuals are going to hell. Speaking in that light, there was an editorial that hit the paper. Some of you may have seen it a couple weeks before Christmas, about 10 days before Christmas. And it was basically saying that people that complete suicide and people that drug overdose are going to hell. And that we have to tell them that hell exists, and then they won't do those things. I went crazy. I sent it to Cindy right away. I have Google alerts, so I'm constantly watching what the papers put out. I asked the newspaper to pull it down, and they would not. They thought it was great to get the conversation going. And then I reminded them that the holidays are a very difficult time for many people. And then they said to me, "Oh, we didn't think about that." Do suicides spike over the holidays? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. We don't really have particular every year they spike, not necessarily. But we did have a couple in a row during that time, and it was very difficult for me. I couldn't understand why the newspaper decided that was so important to print when there's so many other things. And some of you responded, and it was amazing to see some of the letters and the Facebook comments and the support that was shown to pull that down. Please get rid of it. Why would you even draw attention to that? And my point was, there's so many people that are hurting in our community to begin with that did nothing to help them. I have a staff member whose brother completed suicide when she was young, and it literally triggered, something that happened 50 years ago, 40 years ago. So she was a mess with that letter. So things like that, people don't realize the power of their words and how awful that can be to somebody who's suffered suicide in their own life or has mental illness. And so that was all I was trying to do, was trying to get the newspaper to be a little more accountable. I also have a journalism degree in addition to a nursing degree, and I reminded them that I had to take an ethics course just like I'm sure they did too, and I'm not sure that they really passed that course. They were just quiet when I said that, But generally the newspaper's been very good to this topic, and the media's been very good about exposing it, but we were not happy with that particular editorial. And they wanted me to respond right away, and I told them, no, I need some time because I need to count to 10. And I did respond eventually, but in a different way. I did not want to draw attention to that particular letter, so.
And SAMHSA has a whole media package that you can go on and look and how the media should do it. And in fact, the one that happened not too long ago, when I was talking to the reporter, she said, we went through the media training. I said, well, you might want to go through it again, because it was just really off the wall.
Yeah. So anyway, of course it sells papers and generates topic of conversation, but that was really quite distressing. And the thing is, I know this individual that wrote the letter, and that's even makes it worse. But anyway, we addressed it in a different way. We chose to address it in a different way, with trying to get people to realize that people over the holidays especially are very sensitive, and trying to encourage people to reach out to them. And that's how the coroner's office decided to approach it. So, substance abuse and suicide, how do you recognize it, and how do we develop prevention strategies? What's going on here in the York community as well as in the country in general with substance abuse and suicide? I'm not going to bore you and read you that definition, but basically, for those that may not know, the actual term substance abuse has been replaced with substance abuse disorder or substance use disorder in the DSM-5 category or catalog or whatever. It's not a catalog, but directory.
It's like a catalog.
Yeah, it is like a catalog for diagnoses for mental illness. So that's what you see now more than ever, the SAD, S-A-D, for those that may not be aware. So basically it just means that you know, they're functionally, they functionally have significant impairment, health problems, disability, failure to meet their major responsibilities at work, school, or home. And so that's what you use as your definition. So they usually fall into one of these 6 categories: the alcohol use disorder, tobacco use disorder, cannabis use disorder. Some may not believe that there is a cannabis use disorder, but there is. Stimulant use disorder, hallucinogen use disorder, and opioid use disorder, which we're seeing more and more frequently now than we ever have. And I'm not going to go through all this, but I want to touch, and I know this is fine print, I should have made a second slide, sorry. But I want to talk about a couple things here. This is based on, I'm sorry there's like a feedback here, I'm trying to hold it down though. This is based on the 2015 SAMHSA National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and I had old stats up here from the 2014, so I did find the 2015, and we're always about a year behind. They survey individuals 12 years and older, so don't panic and think that all 12-year-olds are, you know, majorly abusing substances, although some of them are. They interview, or the survey is 12 years and older, okay? So interesting that actually that number has fallen slightly. I think it was closer to 52% before, but for 2015, 51.7% of Americans 12 years and older have reported alcohol use in the last month. So the moderate drinking is defined as 1 drink a day for women, and they decreased that. It used to be 2 drinks a day. I don't know if you know that, but they decreased it a couple years ago. 1 drink a day for women, 2 drinks a day for men. They get a pass. They metabolize it a little differently. They're bigger usually. So that's according to this dietary guidelines for Americans from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Binge drinking is 5 or more alcoholic drinks on the same occasion at least 1 day in the last 30 days. Okay, and that's defined by National Institute on Alcohol and Alcoholism. A pattern of drinking that produces blood alcohol concentrations greater than the 0.08, which is considered DUI level. Usually that's 4 drinks for women, 5 drinks for men over a 2-hour period. Some of us went to college. I can guarantee you most every Thursday, Friday night in my college, there was a lot of binge drinking and actually heavy drinking going on, if you count that they did it several weeks in a row. And that was how many years ago, you know, 35, 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And now we have, obviously, still the same problem that's going on in our colleges and universities. 24.9% age 12 or older were considered binge drinkers. And then about not even quite 6%, but adolescents aged 12 to 17, I still think that's a pretty high number, reported at least some sort of binge drinking in the past month in 2015. And then 39%, which is where we kind of figured it would be higher, of the 18 to 25-year-old, you know, the college age, and 25% 26 or older. So there definitely are some adults beyond the age of 25 that are still doing that binge drinking. And then the heavy drinking is 5 or more drinks on the same occasion on each of 5 or more days and 30 days prior. And like I said, I can guarantee you that there were quite a few in my college that were actually heavy drinkers. And I think for some parents, they don't want to accept that that's a reality, but it is really a reality even today. My son actually went to college in Chicago and was in a dorm that was for underage, so nobody over the age of legal, you know, like they were 21 and under, or they were 20 and under. And supposedly no drinking, no drugs, nothing. I had to actually catch a plane in the middle of the night and demand that he be released from his agreement with that particular residence hall because he was living with a heroin addict. And his roommates continually partied, and they were actually under the age of, under the legal age, and supposedly the college, you know, had separate dorms set aside for the kids that were partiers and that were of legal age. So They weren't going to let us out of that contract initially until we actually showed the drinking game detail on the walls of the main part of the lobby. And then they finally decided to release us from the contract and let him go get an apartment on his own. But it was kind of a scary moment because he was living with a heroin addict, and he had already gotten in trouble because they housed him with a 21-year-old who had just gotten out of the military and liked to drink, and they're not supposed to have anybody over the age of 20 in the dorm, and so the whole room, like 4 people that lived in that particular apartment, got in trouble, and he had to go to a hearing. And so it's kind of amazing what goes on in colleges. So even now today, so certainly if you have a kid at college, you want to kind of be in tune with what's going on and make sure that they're, that the rules that are set by that establishment or that university, college or university, are truly being adhered to. Quite often it's a different set of rules when you get actually into the residence hall. Or the dorm, or the apartment that's affiliated with that college, the apartment complex. So, because so many of them are doing that now with these apartment complexes. So check into it as a parent, and we got very involved. I flew up to Chicago in the middle of a blizzard, truthfully, to get him out of that situation. It was really kind of scary. So that's what SAMHSA defines as drinking, 5 or more, heavy drinking, excuse me. And as you can see, 6.5% of the population, which I even higher than the moderate or the binge drinking, define themselves as heavy drinkers. And then of course the college age, that falls 10.9%, and then the adult, it's 26 and older, it falls down to 6.4 from the binge drinking. Genetics is definitely a risk factor for alcohol use disorder. We hear that all the time. We see that. We actually see that in the coroner's office. Quite often, if a parent had a drinking problem, then the alcohol use disorder, then the child or the adult child will also have that problem. Or maybe there's siblings that have the same problem, the same issue with alcohol use disorder. So they develop a tolerance. They actually can die with a blood alcohol much higher than most people. So it takes a lot more over time to actually cause them to die, if that makes sense, with toxicity. So it's not unusual for us to see blood alcohol levels in the 0.29, 0.35 range, 0.4. For individuals to die, it's about 40%, versus the 0.08 for DUI. So we see that frequently in alcohol toxicity. And what happens quite often with them dying is they aspirate. They actually choke on their own vomitus. I'm not trying to be graphic, but just to give you an idea. And that's generally what happens. And by this time, they already have pretty severe liver disease, as well as other things malnutrition. We had one this past year, who died, who had been a heavy drinker for about 30 years, and it's just a slow death, basically. And some people would call it suicide by installment. That's kind of a coroner's joke, sorry. It's unfortunately, it can cause a lot of damage, but it's over a very long period of time. And they can function and work and for a very long time and hide it from family and friends. But many of them choose to stop eating pretty much most kind of normal food. And they're just drinking and snacking, and sometimes they're using Ensure to boost their nutrition and that kind of thing. But very sad situations. We have it quite frequently in the coroner's office. Okay, this cannabis use disorder, we do not generally have deaths from this, okay? This, however, is a very real thing. It's the 3rd most frequently used after alcohol and tobacco, in 2015, SAMHSA says 4 million people aged 12 and older reported some sort of marijuana use disorder. In other words, it altered the function of their daily living. That's what that means. So the immediate effects are right there, as listed: distorted perception, difficulty with thinking, problem solving, loss of motor coordination. Our concern in law enforcement and with the coroner's office is, while people don't generally die from cannabis use disorder or cannabis use in general, They are putting others at risk, just like people who drink and drive. And we are having more and more individuals who are DUI with drugs. And so many of our individuals who die in car crashes have had cannabis in their system. So we do believe it delays their reaction and does affect the driving. You know, I'm not going to get into a political discussion here on the legalization of marijuana, but I will tell you it will add to many problems you know, and I'm not just saying that because it already is the cause of many problems, because people will continue to drive with it just like they do with other drugs in their system, and so it will, and that's the concern of law enforcement, truly, is that it's going to cause additional problems. But it very much is a real thing, okay? People drive with it all the time, sadly, and people die, and people cause other people to die under the influence of marijuana, as well as alcohol, as well as opioids and other drugs. Long-term use, respiratory infection, impaired memory, exposure to cancer-causing compounds. Actually, if a young person is using it before the age of 24, 25, it actually alters their brain, sometimes permanently. That's been proven. And many of them are using it long before the age of 24, 25, before their brain's fully formed. And then the symptoms, obviously, they will have development of tolerance over time. They'll be able to use more and more with it, time. They develop withdrawal symptoms. They're a little different than withdrawal from opioids, but they do develop those. They actually get withdrawal symptoms within 1 week of stopping heavy use. So it definitely is affecting them if they've been using it heavily. When I was in journalism school, I actually was editor of a campus magazine, and one of the key features that we did one year was college students that were functioning and using marijuana on a daily basis. And so they got a couple of them and interviewed them. And it wasn't my idea of an article, but it actually was quite popular. Try breaking that to your dad, who's pretty conservative. That was fun. Yeah, but anyway, what it showed and validated was they weren't functioning really very well at all. While they might have been able to maintain a GPA for a while, it showed that over time, they had pretty severe problems with other things, with relationships, with DUIs and other things that were going on in their lives. So they weren't really functioning very well at all. But it was an interesting article, needless to say. Stimulant use disorder, this actually still goes on. We don't see this quite as often in the coroner's office. But things like amphetamines, Adderall, Ritalin, people take actually, they obtain illegally or they have a legal prescription. Methamphetamine, thank goodness, we don't see that very often, at least on this side of the country. It's more of a problem on the West Coast, but we don't see it in York County hardly at all, thank goodness. Cocaine, believe it or not, has decreased in use. I would say when I first came into office in 2014, we didn't see hardly any cocaine. Now we're starting to see a pickup. Anybody know why that is? Why we're starting to see more cocaine?
I would say the prescription pills are too expensive and hard to get, so they still need that same.
You got it. I mean, the same reason that we're seeing opioids increase. Yes, access to prescription pills is more difficult than it used to be. And what's happening is they're mixing heroin in with the cocaine, and so you get that speedball effect, to increase the high. And so now, when I first took office, we did not routinely autopsy cocaine deaths, suspected cocaine deaths. We just did a toxicology, but now we autopsy all suspected cocaine deaths also, because almost always they have heroin mixed in with the cocaine now. So really deadly combination. Needless to say, people die from heroin a lot more than they do from cocaine, because cocaine's more of a stimulant. The thing that people die from with cocaine is a heart arrhythmia quite often that develops. With heroin, they die because they stop breathing. But now you got the two of them mixed together, along with fentanyl. Throw fentanyl in there yet? Yeah. It's a really deadly combination. So we are autopsying a lot of those cases now. So basically, those symptoms are, they have the cravings, they can't control their use. Cocaine's more expensive. Definitely takes over their life, their finances. Even the Adderall and the other amphetamines are more expensive than heroin. They continue use even when their life is falling apart. They can it's a habit. It's an addiction. They become tolerant. They use all their spare time to try and get those stimulants. And the withdrawal is a little different than opioid withdrawal. It's actually a lot different, but it's very much a real thing also. So. And then we come to opioid use disorder, which is what we're dealing with more largely than anything in the coroner's office when it comes to drugs. So why are they using it? A lot of times to take away pain in their life, sometimes emotional pain, sometimes physical pain. Most opioid addicts, and I'm throwing heroin in with oxys and hydrocodone and some of the prescription pain meds that are out there because it's much the same effect actually. But many of them start out because they've had some sort of chronic injury. And that's really how the majority of my heroin cases, our heroin cases in our office, were once on some sort of prescription pain med. And young people especially, because they use those prescription pain meds for sports injuries and for dental work and things like that. Sometimes they started out recreationally at these, they go to people's houses and they steal them out of their cabinets, or these kids have these skittle parties, farm parties, where they throw all the prescription pain pills into a bowl and they drink and then they take pills to see who's gonna pass out first, basically. Yeah, that goes on. That actually goes on in York County. So that's how many of them start out, either recreationally or with a sports injury, the majority with a sports injury or some sort of injury, chronic injury. Sometimes they're in a traffic accident, they have a chronic back injury, that kind of thing. Or they've had surgery of some sort. And so most will tell you that after one prescription, they were hooked, okay? And what makes somebody get hooked more quickly than another person? And there's been all kinds of studies done, but basically the data shows that it's the chemistry of the brain. And I'm not gonna bore you, but I will just briefly address, your dopamine receptors, your pleasure receptors in your brain. Some of you know this already. They get fired up with opioids. The same things that give you pleasure right now, sex, your relationships, food. There's a certain number that, if you can sort of think of it that way, that it gets fired up to with those things. With opioids, you can kind of picture that in the person who has a tendency towards opioid addiction, sometimes it's genetic, it will get fired up like 10, 100 times more. And so with just one round of opioid pills or 1 or 2 doses of heroin, many addicts tell us that they were hooked after just 1 or 2 doses of heroin or 1 round of a prescription. So why do some people, you or I might take doctor prescribes a couple pain pills, you go home with them after an injury, you take 1 or 2 and you don't like how it makes you feel and you stick them in your cabinet and you never take them again, but you save them because you're York County, you're Pennsylvania Dutch, and you want to hang on to them because you never know when you might need them, or maybe your son might need them. Well, we don't want you doing that anymore. We want you getting rid of those pills, because people literally will break into your cabinets, or kids will have their friends will come over and they'll use your bathroom and they'll take 2 here, 2 there. You won't notice right away. So please get rid of those pills to your local police department. But for most of us, we don't have that tendency, okay? But there are people that there is actually a genetic tendency that their dopamine receptors get fired up so much more. And so after just 1 or 2 rounds of heroin or opioids, their brain is already starting the conditioning process, much like Pavlov's dog, if you remember, okay? From psychology courses. Your brain is already getting fired up with that. And so then what happens is that high is gone. They can never get that first high back. And so they're constantly in search. So that's why it's called chasing the dragon. They're chasing that high, and then if they're not high, they're in withdrawal. And the withdrawal is described as the worst flu in the world 100 times over. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, a lot worse than any of these other withdrawals. And so then they're using to fight the withdrawal. And that's actually what most addicts will tell you after just a couple rounds of heroin, a couple rounds of prescription drugs, they are actually fighting to help and curb that withdrawal, that dope sickness. And we get parents all the time that will tell us, he's been really sick with the flu lately, you know, when we show up at the house. And, well, how can you describe the flu? Well, you know, he was okay for a couple days, or, you know, he goes to work and then he's okay, comes home at night, he's sick as can be. Well, they're going through withdrawal. And then when parents realize that, it's really hard for them, because then they feel like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of guilt, you know, that I missed seeing those signs. But yeah, and so they can function for a while and actually work in the workplace, but we have cases where they actually die out in their cars on their break because they're using. They die at the McDonald's because they're using. They hide it well from people for a while. The food industry is one of the most affected industries where individuals are heroin addicts or opioid addicts, even the healthcare industry. So you are probably working with an opioid or heroin addict at this moment and you don't even realize it. It is that common. And so I realized after I read the objectives again last night that one of the objectives was to talk about the signs and symptoms of addiction and what to look for. And I realized that I didn't actually build it into the PowerPoint, so I apologize. So that's why I laid it on the table. So make sure that you look through that then and take a copy home with you. Because we get questions all the time, how do I know when somebody's using? How do I know if my loved one's using? And we do a presentation in the workplace for employers too, and they often will ask, how do I know if somebody's using? But you know, this is a disease, just like anything else, and it's becoming our biggest thing, and suicide. These two things, are they interrelated? And that's what we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But you know, there is some relationship. Obviously, a lot of these individuals. Not only are they trying to numb the pain and take care of the dope sickness, but they also have some of them have a lot of social issues going on in their life. They've had some adverse childhood experiences. Some of them come from perfectly normal homes. Some of them have been struggling all their lives. And so you can imagine how hard it is and why it's so difficult to get these individuals to a point of sobriety, because you know, 30 days doesn't fix all the problems that are going on in their life, 30 days in rehab. And so you do 30 days of rehab, you try to recondition their brain, and actually that brain chemistry that I was talking about that's been altered by the opioids, they say can take months to even years to reverse the damage that's done by that. And that's why so many of them need longer stints in rehab, or you hear about them going in and out of rehab over and over again, because they just haven't gotten the point where their brain is reconditioned back to where those things are not causing that spike in dopamine, and where we can find other things to cause that spike in dopamine that are much more appropriate. If you try to rehab somebody and you send them back to all their same social problems and their same friends and and you haven't worked on that, or taught them how to cope with that, it's just going to be a vicious cycle. And that's what we're seeing over and over again. So basically, 2 million people in 2015 reported this disorder, this pain reliever disorder, prescription drugs. 122,000 adolescents. I mean, that's just mind-boggling to me. 122,000 adolescents.
Is this just York County?
No. This is nationally. Sorry. Yeah, no. We'll talk about the York County stats here in a minute. But good question. So approximately 427,000 young adults aged 18 to 25. So you can see where even in the young adult population, and 1.5 million adults 26 or older. And that is where we're seeing it more frequently in the older young adult, I guess you could say. Not that we don't see it at the high school level, but mostly we see prescription pain pill addiction starting maybe at the high school level, but dabbling in it. And then by the time they hit their 20s, they're strong in their prescription pain addiction. And then because they are expensive and harder to get now, they switch to heroin. They start, and I get parents all the time that tell me, oh my gosh, my kid would never touch a needle. And we understand that. However, many of them start out with their friends injecting them. They don't inject themselves. And then they do cross over eventually, almost all of them, to injecting themselves. But it's really hard for parents to accept that until that toxicology comes back, and then we have to tell them that. So basically, there's a strong desire. They cannot control their ability to use. They try to reduce, and they get sick. And it interferes with every aspect of their life eventually. They choose the drug over their family, over their job, over their children. They get depressed. It's a vicious cycle. They want to stop and they can't. We have actually had some who have written suicide notes, obviously, definitely with prescription drugs, and killed themselves with prescription drugs, but we've also had some complete suicide with heroin and actually written a note. However, it's important for you to realize that most heroin-related deaths that you hear us report about are not suicides. They are accidental. Almost all of them are accidental. And how do we know that? Well, you know, we base it on the fact that, you know, we don't think that they were intending to end their life that particular day. They were going about their normal activities, that kind of thing. You know, if they write a note, if there was some being treated for depression and a big struggle with their drug addiction, then we might consider it a suicide. We'll talk to the family and we'll talk about it a little bit. But most of the time, for heroin at least, the death due to heroin is almost always accidental. But we, like I said, we are starting to see a few now lately that are actually using it as a suicide method. So what's the link between substance use disorder and suicide? You're generally 6 times more likely to report a suicide attempt in somebody's life if they are using or abusing substances. So they're 6 times more likely. It makes them more prevalent to at least attempt. Veterans with substance abuse disorder are 2.5 or 2.3 times more likely to die by suicide. And we are starting to see that more and more with veterans. It's not unusual now even for us to see some of our heroin, we have heroin deaths in people in their 40s and 50s, and several of them have been veterans this last year. The majority of those with substance abuse will never die by suicide, thankfully, but it is still very much a connection there. We see older men who use substances are at greater risk for non-fatal and for death. So older men are at risk for both of those, at least for the attempts and also for dying from it. We actually, with our heroin-related deaths, our oldest individual so far was 68 years old. So we are starting to see a little creep up between the 40s, 50s, and 60s, more than what we had in this last year anyway. Some other risk factors: there's been past suicide attempts, mood disorder, depression, obviously opiate, cocaine, sedatives, recent increase in alcohol use. A lot of our heroin deaths, decedents have had alcohol in their system when they die. Many of them have a cocktail of all kinds of things. Antidepressants, a lot of them have antidepressants. Some of them cocaine, and fentanyl is used to be in about a third. We hardly ever saw any fentanyl in 2014. 2015, it was in about a third of our deaths, and now it's in more than half of our heroin-related deaths. So we are seeing fentanyl over and over again. They think they're getting heroin, instead they're getting fentanyl. Or sometimes they kind of know that they might be getting fentanyl, but it's a bigger high. So they're willing to take that risk, even though it's 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. So it's definitely a deadly combination. And then those who commit serious violent acts are 2 times more likely to report multiple suicide attempts. So that's how it's linked. We get asked all the time, do we routinely do a tox on all suicides? We do not. That may change eventually, but at this point, that was the policy before I came into office, and I've decided to keep it at this point. Part of that is, the rationale behind it is, if we don't know, we're gonna do a tox. You know, if we're not sure, we're gonna do a toxicology. We might even do an autopsy sometimes. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, especially with gun suicide, suicide by gun. And there's all kinds of, we go through training, and so do the police, and we're working with them and the detectives and sometimes the county detectives to figure all that out. We treat it as homicide at first, and we work our way down to where we can determine for sure if it's a suicide. But one of the reasons that we don't do a toxicology routinely is that when we do, or when we have in the past, the families quite often want us to not put suicide down, and they want us to say it's accidental by whatever substance they were using. And while we can be sensitive to that and appreciate that, then I don't think it really helps us draw attention to the fact that this was a suicide, and it doesn't address the problem. And while they may have been under the influence and acted impulsively while they were under the influence, it doesn't change the fact that they completed suicide. And so sometimes it can be really difficult for families. I have a family right now that's still very angry from 2 years ago with a ruling that we made because they wanted it so badly to be accidental. And actually we did a toxicology on that one. So if we do a toxicology, I always tell the families right away, or an autopsy, okay, I'm gonna do this, and it's up to us to decide, we don't routinely do it. If I do this, I need you to promise me that whatever ruling we come down with, you will be able to accept, They say they will, but many times they still fight me on it. But it's just a difficult thing, and that's that whole stigma thing that we were talking about. It's just really hard, and then also sometimes there's insurance tied in. And they want it to be an accident for the double indemnity. If they've had the policy long enough, many times it will cover suicide, but it's just really hard for families. There's still so much a shunning and a stigma. I mean, we just had one a couple weeks ago, and the family was just adamant that nobody find out that this was a suicide. Meanwhile, other relatives posted on Facebook, and now everybody knows it's a suicide. So it just gets. It's just a fine dance sometimes and really difficult. But that's one of the main reasons we don't. So deaths from drug overdose have been steadily rising over the last 2 decades and have really become our leading cause of injury death in the coroner's office in York as well as in the US. You hear all the time that we've had more deaths from drug overdoses than car crashes. You hear it in the news all the time. And that's really pretty much common for every coroner's office, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, and I would say, pretty much in the Mid-East or Mid-Atlantic area. So the United States, as you know, is in the midst of a huge opioid overdose epidemic. California's starting to see it now. It used to be methamphetamine was what they saw more than ever, but we are starting to hear that more and more heroin and opioid deaths are happening in the California area. So it is reaching throughout the whole country. But I would say largely the places that are most affected right now is the entire eastern coastline as well as the southern, mid-south, and some of those areas, Midwest. Opioids have killed more than 33,000 people in 2015, more than any year on record. And nearly half of them involved a prescription opioid. We are not seeing that percentage in New York. I think we're kind of ahead of the game, unfortunately, because we're kind of more urban. And we are actually seeing about 2/3 of our, right now for this year, we have 102, actually I think I have the stats here, so let me get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. Let's talk about our suicide deaths. And Cindy and I were just confirming our numbers here, because this is what I have, what I was saying earlier. So we'll have to kind of figure out our numbers later. But basically 87 suicides in 2014, highest number ever that we've had, 67 in 2015. And right now, we have one pending right now, but we have 69 suicides at this point in 2016. And I told you about the teen suicides. You can see that we had 0 in 2015, which we kind of think is ironic because that's when we started the Avidum grant and try and get the Avidum clubs into the school. Who knows if there's a connection there, but we think that that was kind of neat that, obviously, thank goodness our deaths, we had none in 2015 teen suicides. Many of our adult suicides obviously involve substance use and abuse, but many do not. So we have quite a few that do not. We believe that substance use abuse actually helps lower their inhibitions and makes them more willing to obviously complete suicide. Makes it easier sometimes for them. They're sometimes acting very impulsively, sometimes they have it well planned out. Sometimes there's notes, sometimes there's not. When there's not notes, it's a little bit harder for us as investigators. And even when there are notes, because we got to make sure. I mean, we have a situation, sometimes we have one right now that we're looking at where a family member may have written the note, you know, and that can get a little touchy, you know. How do you explain to the family member that, you know, that was not a suicide? That's really bizarre usually because we don't have people that want their loved one to have died of suicide, but, you know, we still have to look at all those notes forensically and try and figure out what's going on. We've had individuals who have recorded their suicide attempt on their phone, both visually as well as audibly, with prescription pills as well as with hanging and guns. So, and then of course you've heard of the most recent situation where we had the young mother post on Facebook, and apparently that hit all over the world because I just got some sort of, I get Google alerts and I got some sort of feed from Europe that showed, and of course they had all the facts screwed up. You know, it's like, how do you call that reporter and tell them to fix things? I don't know, I'm still working on that one. But yeah, it's just kind of amazing the impact that it had worldwide with Sherry Shermeyer posting her note on Facebook. And just so sad, so tragic that, you know, we say to ourselves all the time, we don't know why they take children with them, but you know, their pain is so great that they, I think, sometimes feel that nobody else can raise that child the way that they want them to be raised, unfortunately. So those are some of the main reasons that we think, you know, that they're more prone with the substance use and abuse, obviously. There's usually a lot of things going on in their life. There's usually a relationship issue, financial issue. You heard Cindy refer to some of the reasons. One of the saddest things that I think that it's hard for us sometimes is some of the young people, young adults who complete suicide. Maybe they just got charged with a DUI. We've had a couple of those. And they just feel that they're going to be such a disappointment to their family that they would rather end their life. And so we've actually had that. We have to figure out a way to reach those young adults and help them realize that as tragic as it is, it's not the end of the world. And these are individuals who these were single car accidents. You know, they didn't injure other people, and not that justifies it, but it's just there's a gap there. We're not reaching those young people, and that's very concerning to us. Of those that we have tested, some use alcohol only, some use multiple drugs. Obviously, it fluctuates. Some are using illegal drugs. Only in the last 2 years have we seen heroin being used as a suicide method, and like I said, it's really infrequent. It doesn't happen. Now, are there some that we suspect might have been suicide? Sure. But when we don't have really hardcore evidence, we defer to accidental. You know, that's why I said earlier some people would consider substance use being a suicidal attempt. But we do believe that most of them are accidental. I know that there's some coroners who are calling them homicides from the beginning, the heroin deaths. We chose not to do that because we believe that there's some culpability on the individual's part. And so the coroner's definition of homicide doesn't really stand up in court anyway. It doesn't have legal merit. I don't know if you knew that or not. And so it still has to go through a trial, and then it'll be up to a court to decide if it's homicide or not. And we are using a drug charge, drug delivery resulting in death here in York County, and that is sort of a form of homicide, basically. And we have had some successful convictions on that. So because I have a DA's office that cooperates with me, we have no need to call them homicides, we call them accidentals. But I know there was a Facebook feed for a while about how awful Pam Gay is because she doesn't call them homicides. And now they'll have no chance of getting convicted, but that has nothing to do with it, and people don't understand that. But when there is some culpability on the individual's part, we don't feel that it's, you know, we can really truthfully call it a homicide totally. But that's what most coroners do, they call them accidentals. But this coroner was kind of doing this to try and get his DA to get more aggressive with prosecuting drug delivery resulting in death, and we're fortunate we have a DA who's very aggressive with doing that. So there's no need for us to do that. How do we decide if it's suicide versus homicide versus accidental versus undetermined? That can get a little difficult. Sometimes we have some that we have one right now that we've been working on for probably 4 years, right before I came in to office. And so there are some that are just mind-boggling and you just cannot figure it out. Thankfully, there's not too many of them. So you hire other experts, you get other people to look, you get fresh sets of eyes to look at these cold cases, and you do what you can. But I would much rather rule something undetermined than call it something that it isn't. So we do have a few that are undetermined right now. We have 1 or 2 of those that are probably suicide, but we just don't know for sure. And we won't call it that. We'd rather call it undetermined. So we're very careful with what we rule. But like I said, we work all of these cases as a homicide initially. So it's not unusual, even at a suicide scene, to have the whole forensics team there for a while from the county, working that scene, kind of working it as best they can, collecting evidence and trying to rule out. And then sometimes by the time they leave, we pretty much know it's a suicide. And sometimes when they leave, we don't know for sure. So we have to wait for testing to come back, gunshot residue and things like that. So we don't hesitate to get them involved if we just don't know. And we just don't want to make that guess just yet. So we do get them involved pretty early on at some of these scenes. But sometimes it's very obvious, especially if it's a close contact wound. Hangings, if there's no defensive wounds, and obviously in a hanging, the person has generally hung themselves. There's lots of ways, and we go through all kinds of courses and continuing ed to stay on top of that. It's hard for families though, or friends. I mean, I have people call us all the time and there's just no way they would have completed suicide. There's just no way. And they don't know what we know. And unless it's immediate family, we can't really reveal any of that. And so some families don't want to tell the friends. So there are a lot of people who question us, and I can't divulge how I know, and it just gets difficult sometimes. Some of them are very powerful people who have questioned our rulings. But we can only release some of that information to the immediate next of kin. And some of them don't want to tell other people. That's their prerogative. We get asked all the time why sometimes suicides are in the paper. I don't like to put them in the paper, believe me. But if it's in a public place, unfortunately, I'm obligated to put it in the paper. Most of the time the media is already there. But sometimes if it's in a private residence and the media sees people assembling around a house, they'll call me and they'll say, what's going on? I'm like, we're not there yet, and I won't confirm until we're there. But then when they hear that it's a suicide in a private residence, they will back down and they will just go away, which is good. They do respect that. But there are times when it's in a public setting where we have to release the information, the name, and the whole works, which I would really rather not, but I'm required because it's a coroner's case in a public place. So the drug ODs were the leading cause of death in 2014, 110 overall, 62 that were heroin-related. For those of you, some of you know this already. They were also the leading cause in 2015. 95, our drug overdoses in general fell down a little bit, although you got to remember the year before I took office, some of you may know, they were only in the 50s and 60s. So our drug overdose deaths have skyrocketed since 2014. So 95 overdoses in 2015, 65 of those 95 were heroin related. 102 Narcan saves in 2015. 85 of those 95 deaths, by the way, were opioid if you count the heroines in with the prescription drugs. So you can see how prescription drugs and heroin have taken over the drug overdose deaths, unfortunately, in this county. 101, actually we're now 102 confirmed drug ODs year to date for 2016, and we actually have now 10 suspected. So this numbers have changed just in the week since I've done this. We have 66 out of 102 are confirmed heroin related now in the week since I've done this, and 10 are suspected heroin related is what I meant earlier by the 10. So we will probably be a slightly more overdose deaths due to heroin than last year. We have had 238 saves with Narcan in 2016. I didn't put that up there. I know a lot of people think that that is enabling, and I always say enabling them to live another day till they can hopefully get treatment. Most people that have dealt with addiction know that you can't force an addict to get help. They will go when they want to go, and when they're ready. There's a narrow window. And if you force them to go, you can lock them up and put them in prison, and they'll get back out and start using again and die because they don't have any tolerance built up. Okay, we believe just like people who have chronic heart disease, or maybe they have by their diet developed heart disease, and they continue to go out and get the maple donuts and they don't exercise, or the chronic smoker who continues to smoke in spite of knowing all the things that it can cause, and it will cause their death eventually, and they will continue to smoke. We still will resuscitate those individuals when they collapse in front of us. As healthcare providers, we're required to do that. That's part of our job. You know, we preserve life, we do no harm. And so this is a disease, and so you have to think of it that way. And they are sometimes in need of repeated interventions, just like anybody with heart disease or chronic smoking. And so I know that that doesn't fly with some people, but we believe in our office, as well as in the Heron Task Force, that that is how you have to approach this, and hope that eventually it will click and they will go get help. Part of the problem is we don't have enough beds. You heard about the mental health issue. Well, we also have that issue with rehab and detox. So they might be able to get a detox bed, but then they have to wait 5 days to get a rehab bed. And so that narrow window is gone. Or they might not even be able to get a detox bed right away. Thankfully, we just had another detox facility open in York, Safe Haven, in addition to White Deer Run. So we're making some progress. Things have improved, but we have a long way to go with this issue. And we have changed our name, for those that may not know, to the York Opiate Regional Collaborative. That's going to change again here shortly to make it more simple. But that is basically, we got funding through grants and private funding to help fund an executive position. And Dr. Matt Howie from the Medical Health Bureau here in the city is going to be very active with helping us kind of get more organized as a community. We also have a needle exchange program that runs in York. I know there was a lot of controversy when that first started, but actually trying to get clean needle, or dirty needles off the street, getting decreasing HIV and Hep C. All the research shows it does not increase heroin usage, because heroin addicts are not waiting to start using heroin until clean needles come into town. Believe me, they use needles 60, 70 times sometimes. That's why they get Hep C, HIV. We want to try and decrease those instances of those diseases, and the clean needle exchange helps that significantly. Plus, it actually, those individuals as workers talk them into getting into treatment. So we think it's a win-win situation in the long run. All the counties around us have had needle exchange programs for 20 years. York has one of the worst heroin problems, and we don't have a needle exchange until this May we got one. So it's a mobile program. Volunteers and paid workers work that program throughout the city, and our hopes are to expand to other areas of the county eventually. So I told you a little bit about Avidum earlier. It launched in those schools. Correct me if I have anything wrong there, Cindy. But I think I based it off of here in my conversation there. And then Cindy also worked on the mandated suicide prevention training. If you don't know about Avidum, I encourage you to go to that website and learn a little more about it. It's a pretty amazing program, and it's done some great things. The kids, it's just kind of neat how they've run with it at the schools, and the schools that implemented it. And the banana suit basically is showing, it's a visual that's used to show kids that you can't always, depression doesn't stick out like a banana, a yellow banana, somebody walking around in a suit. You need to learn the signs and what to look for. You're not always going to be able to see it real obviously, and how can you look for it in your peers, and what to do. Who do you report it to when you see it, or how do you get them the help that they need? And that's what Avidum's about. And we put this up here just so that people understand that how this is plaguing our community, even in our young people. Dylan, his family has been very vocal. had a long history of well, not a long history, he was a young boy, but he had a history of heroin use and succumbed to his addiction. His family has been very vocal, just like families are getting more vocal about suicide and putting them in obituaries. Families are doing that with heroin addiction too. Many of these individuals have been battling, mental health issues, issues going on in their lives for a long time, even at a young age. And so we want people to understand this is the face of substance use in York County. It's not what people think: homeless, jobless, roaming the street. Dylan's just one of many faces, and I encourage you to go to Not One More York Chapter's Facebook page to see a lot of other faces. The stereotype is gone, and it's definitely a lot different than it was in the 60s and 70s. And I'm not going to go into that because we're running out of time, but I do want to just talk about one or two things. We do heroin autopsies on all our heroin-related deaths. Because we do go after the dealer with a charged drug delivery resulting in death. There's a lot of question about that, but we do them routinely on all our heroin deaths. That was a policy that changed when I took office. That's what's recommended by the National Association of Medical Examiners as a best practice. Yes, that gets costly to the taxpayer, but we believe that if we had had 62 homicides in 1 year, people would have been clamoring for some sort of change. Up until 2014, drug deaths were treated as, well, a junkie's a junkie, let's move on to the next case. And literally just a toxicology done, and that was it, no charges, generally, it was really hard to prosecute. And we decided we needed to get more aggressive because we could see this problem was escalating. So that's why we do send them for autopsy. And prescription drug deaths, it's a little different right now. We do not send them routinely for autopsy. It's very difficult to get that done, but because it's hard to prove something legal, needless to say. However, there is a monitoring program in existence now, and hopefully that will help maybe with doctors who are overprescribing, but they are cracking down on that too. And WellSpan and OSS are really getting aggressive with training their providers to decrease their opioid prescribing drastically. We'll allow a couple questions. I don't know if any of you have any that you want to just voice, or we can collect a few. I'm sorry, we're already at our time here, Ann. Can we take a few minutes? Or? Okay.
One of the things I was sitting here thinking about that I wasn't addressed, you have to take care of yourself. And if you are going through an issue with someone that has died by suicide in your workplace, or someone has died with a drug overdose or whatever, you must take care of yourself. And I know Pam and I are always available to get out and help people work through it. Sometimes EAP is not enough. Sometimes people need more, and you need to allow them to take that time and have some crisis intervention. If they need more than that, you need to help them get the help that they need. But families, are always needing help too. So take care of yourself when you're walking through something like this. It can drain you. It can really it can drain you at home. When you go home at night, you take it with you. So if you need some help with it, call Pam or I, and we will certainly address it with you.
Good question here. One person wrote, I heard of families trying to remove evidence of suicide. They also try to remove evidence of drug overdose too. Why would the families want it to be suicide by writing a note when there wasn't one? Good question, because we kind of thought the same thing. But the more we talked to this individual, we realized he was mortified about the fact that his brother might have died of a drug overdose. He would much rather have it be a suicide than a drug overdose. Kind of strange, but we have one case like that. So, where can a heroin addict get Suboxone methadone right away to hold them over till bed opens at White Deer Run? Good question. There are some physicians who prescribe Suboxone. I would encourage you to go to Not One More's Facebook page or York Adams Drug and Alcohol, and they can give you some idea of where to search for that. Also, Heroin Task Force website has some of that information, but I would mostly go either to Not One More York Chapter or the York Adams Drug and Alcohol. They're going to give you a number to go directly to White Deer Run, and then of course it's going to go on a waiting list. So maybe Not One More might be able to help you a little better with some of the physicians that prescribe, but York Adams Drug and Alcohol can tell you that information too, because they have a list of physicians that prescribe Suboxone. Methadone is a little more difficult, it's much more controlled. You know, there are physicians that prescribe methadone, but not routinely to drug addiction unless you've been in recovery or, you know, you're working towards sobriety. Most of the time you have to go through the clinic for the methadone, but there are more providers who do write for Suboxone, and hopefully the goal is to get more providers who are willing to do that. It's a task because, you know, they need to monitor those individuals very closely because Suboxone is diverted a lot. It's sold, and then they replace it with heroin. So it's a touchy thing. We do believe strongly in medication-assisted treatment in the coroner's office as well as the Heroin Task Force. We've kind of had a whole epiphany on that. We do think for some people that's their only path to sobriety. Matter of fact, most of my addicts who die trying to be abstinent. We don't have too many that die with methadone and Suboxone in their system. There are a few, but a lot more die trying to be abstinent. Because why do you think? They have no tolerance. They use once or twice after they've been abstinent, and they die right away because they try to use at the same level, and that's why. But that's a great question. But you know, it's not easy trying to get something to hold them over. And then the other thing is they have to have a dirty urine to get into detox. So many of them have been abstinent for a little bit, now they have to use to get into detox. And so some die, you know, the night before they get into detox. So that gets a little crazy too. But that's the insurance rules. Because obviously you have to show that you had something in your system, you know. Is refusing life-saving medications and or refusing food and water considered suicide? Not in the coroners. Well, I would say refusing food and water could be considered suicide. We haven't had that yet since I've been in office. But refusing life-saving medications, a lot of times that's a compliance issue, and there are a lot of adults that do that every day. So we do not consider that suicide at this point. That's probably a mental health issue. Shut-ins with little social activity, I see what you're saying, but you know, we don't really call them suicides. A lot of times the physician signs off on those cases and we don't even get involved. So.
You also have to be careful that older adults sometimes hoard their medications and stuff too. So you have to be careful of that. So if you're looking after a parent or somebody, check their medications, see how often they use it, and all that good stuff.
I was trying to give you the mic, sorry.
This gentleman has his hand up.
I had a number of questions, but most of those were answered in the second presentation, so thank you. The only question I have is about the Narcan. That currently is only in the hands of health professionals, is that not correct?
No, anybody can get Narcan over the counter. Anybody can walk into a pharmacy and you don't have to have a prescription. Anybody can, good question, you can get Narcan, yeah. And if you do not have the funding to get it, again, go to Not One More York chapter, they will get it for you. Okay, but yeah, anybody can get Narcan now, thank goodness. Right? Great, thank you.
Okay, so I want to thank the ladies. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you.